Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as I'm joined by two distinguished guests. To my right, I'm with Joyce Moy. She is the Executive Director of the Asian American Asian Research Institute at CUNY. And next to her is Dr. Bessie W. Blake. She's an award-winning author and publisher. And we're so happy to have you both here. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Well, you know, a couple of years ago, we had the pleasure of discussing a very important topic as it relates to understanding the commonalities between African American and Asian American history, particularly Chinese Americans. And I wanted to continue this, particularly with both of you, as we look at this, because as our communities, basically of color, particularly dominant here in the United States, but particularly here in New York, I just want to get our audience an overview of the understanding of the commonality. Let's start with your personal experiences here. Let's start with you, Joyce.
Well, thanks so much for this opportunity. I really am looking forward to getting to know Bessie better. We've had some great conversations.
Yes.
I am Chinese American. I'm the fourth generation of my family in the United States. Most people don't realize how long Asians have been in this country. The term Asian itself also is something that not everyone understands. It really covers a broad category of peoples. So when you look at the U.S. Census, it includes people from East Asia, such as the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans. It also includes Southeast Asians, which would include Vietnamese, Cambodians, people from Laos, and so on. And when we're talking about South Asia, we're talking about India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, for example. So the category is very broad. But in addition to that, there's an international perspective. From an international perspective, there are people from the countries of Central Asia. So for example, people from Iran consider themselves to be Asian. And oftentimes, we at the Asian American Asian Research Institute here at CUNY work with these populations, and people are not aware that they self-identify as Asian. So the Asians have been here for a very long time, and I've had a unique experience in terms of living in New York City and growing up in New York City. And then later on, my family, feeling that Chinatown was not as safe a community as my parents wanted it to be, decided to move us out to a small town in Long Island called Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was a largely African American community. And I must say that my experiences there really helped me to understand the nature of the racialized society that we have here in the U.S. For example, the first time I had ever seen a picture of Mao Zedong and of, at that time, Comrade Kim Il-sung, the former leader of North Korea, was in the centerfold of the Black Panther paper. I had also made a number of friends who invited me to church. I had gone to church for the first time, something that I had not experienced earlier. And as I got to know the families, I asked them where they came from. So my friend said to me, "Oh, we come from the South." And I said, "Oh, okay, where before the South?" And they said, "We don't know." And that's when I realized that the difference between myself and my African American friends was that I knew where my family came from. I knew the village my great-grandfather came from. I even knew the particular corner of that village that he came from. And I began to realize that for African Americans, everything that made them strong, every inch of their culture that sustained them was ripped away in order to enslave them. And I took that perspective with me as I continued my education, as I began to work with communities and so on. And I think it's something that not many people really understand. and particularly newer immigrants in the Asian community don't have a sense of this racialized nature of the United States. I also have to tell you that I was very moved when Jesse Jackson ran for president. And I heard him use the term African American for the first time. But then I thought to myself too, wow, he's identified the continent. But the people who descended from Africa don't know the specific country. For example, they wouldn't be able to say, I'm Ghanaian or I'm of Nigerian descent. Again, because of the brutality of the history of the African American people here. So my children are 5th generation and my grandchildren are 6th generation Asian Americans. They see themselves more as Asian Americans. I think my generation saw ourselves more as Chinese Americans.
Bessie?
Well, I am an American-born African American, and I've done genealogy on, research on my family. And as Joyce was saying, it's very difficult to reconstruct the history. So as far as I could reach back in various primary documents, my family came here. I'm 7th generation, wow. And my children are 8th, and my grandchildren are 9th generation. So we've been in America for a very long time. And during that time I've been here, I've been called field hand, I've been called colored, I've been called Negro. And when I was growing up, that term Negro just easily slid to the N-word on many tongues, because I was in the Deep South in Texas and Louisiana. And finally, by the time I got to college, we were beginning to say black. And so that was a part of my growing up. When I was in school, I didn't learn about slavery or about any history of my people from textbooks. I learned about slavery from my great-grandparents and from my grandfather. My grandfather's father was a slave. 2 of my great-grandmothers were slaves, and I got to know them intimately. I still can taste my Grandma Becky's chicken and dumpling, for example. Also, my grandfather told me the first stories of slavery, and he was a tenant farmer, and he told me about, the hardships, and so that's how I learned about slavery. My mother, when I was around 7 years old, left that tenant farm in Texas, and she went to Louisiana. She ended up in servitude on a sharecropper's plantation. So I know firsthand what it feels like to be a runaway slave, because we had to escape from that plantation in the middle of the night for fear that the overseer was chasing us, with a gun. When I got to Louisiana, I continued my education. I had started on the plantation in a one-room schoolhouse, but in Louisiana, it was like a cut above. We had 3 frame buildings, and they were very tight little rooms, and there, black children or African-American children, but at that time, Negro children, were educated 1st through 6th grade, and that was all I knew. I had never been inside of a brick building, although there was a brick school building across town. I knew nothing about it. Then suddenly this magnificent thing happened. This was in 1953. We graduated from the little wooden frame houses, and we went into this spacious, ultra-modern, beautiful, sprawling brick building Well, up to that time, the only brick building I had been inside of was with my mother when she was doing domestic work. So this was truly tremendous. And we had the latest equipment, but we had the same used textbooks that were sent across town for us to read. Through undergraduate and graduate school, I went to historically black colleges. After that, I came to New York after meeting my husband, and I got my doctorate from Columbia, and I did postdoctoral work at Harvard. And that educational journey and having that sense of what my people had been deprived of, because the first story I had from my grandfather was about education and how my slave great-grandfather taught my grandmother how to read. And that grandmother was also named Bessie. And I've had from that a commitment to empowerment through education.
Thank you. Now, I just want, you've basically shared particularly the African American experience, which is definitely a part of your direct experience.
Right.
Now I want to talk to you about the early experience of early Chinese Americans. What brought early immigrants from China here? What circumstances?
Well, there were a lot of what they call push-pull factors. There was tremendous famine in China. So the original immigrants to the United States came from a southern part of China along the coast. Flood and famine was a major issue there. And so that pushed people to look for ways to survive, to send money home, to be able to support their families back home. So the opportunity to join a labor force and come to the United States really was a major attraction for them. People did not realize how hard the journey was itself. They did not realize the nature of the labor that they would be engaged in once they got here. There used to be an expression called, you don't stand a Chinaman's chance. And one of the reasons for that was that they tied dynamite on the backs of Chinese workers, had them scramble over the side of a mountain to put the dynamite blasts there, and then you had to scramble back over to the other side or you were dead. And people were so afraid that to write home about this, to tell their families about the way that life was in the United States, that more and more people kept coming because of that. They were essentially indentured servants. The passage to the United States was paid for by these intermediary groups, and until they earned enough money to pay that back, they could not go back to China. There were many people who died on their way here. Their families were never told that, because if they were told, then the families might not help to pay for the passage of that individual to the United States.
And in terms of once coming to a circumstance, obviously trying to find ways, mostly I understand it was men who came,
That's
women
correct.
did not come, finding very harsh treatment. What about the way the treatment, particularly of the Asian communities, particularly from China who came, how were they treated? Did the dominant society put them, what kind of categories, and how did they find survival here?
Well, there was obviously a myth about the Chinese. They were these difficult people to understand. They were not savages necessarily, but they weren't human either. When you look at the way that they characterized them in terms of exaggerating their features, talking about the fact that they slept in opium dens, and they were essentially villainized and really portrayed as the other. As a matter of fact, the laws began to exclude the Chinese, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was a major piece of American history that very few people know about. If you were of Chinese heritage, you could not become a U.S. citizen. At one point, even if you were born here and of Chinese heritage, you could not become a U.S. citizen. So I often identify myself as being the fourth generation of my family in the United States, because my great-grandfather, my grandfather, even my father, 10 years before my birth, could not become a U.S. citizen. So I, having been born here, am a U.S. citizen. And that is because the Chinese fought that law all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was determined that if you are born in the United States, you are an American citizen.
So when we look at the experiences, particularly the commonality, the struggle, we also get to the point, particularly as African Americans coming out of slavery, Reconstruction, and also dealing with Jim Crow racism. Talk about that challenge in terms of us, like we talked about the struggle for dignity and how education was that ticket to dignity, but we still had to deal with the racism. Talk about that, how it impacts you particularly, but the family and the community as well.
Yes. Well, I want to talk about work. Start there. We had an expression also, Joyce, it was like working from sun up to sundown. And just because officially slavery was ended, it didn't mean that we were free or that we had full citizenship. So African Americans continued to work in the field, and there was continual brutal treatment of African Americans, violence. That Jim Crow era was a time of lynching, and I remember that you know, there were certain attitudes that existed where you had to not say but so much around white Americans, but also within a very close-knit group of African Americans. So it just bred distrust among us, because someone might go back and say something in the home where they were working, or say something in the field, or maybe the overseer would overhear, and someone would be lynched. So it was a very difficult time in which to just survive. And although we talked about citizenship, we were supposed to have gotten our citizenship with the amendment to the Constitution. And then in 1875, I think it was, there was a civil rights bill that was supposed to ensure that all of the states implemented those, that new amendment, and that the African American would have full freedom with the emancipation. But that Civil Rights Act only lasted for 10 years. And then came Jim Crow, which was really very difficult to live under. And so I sometimes think that more than civil rights, ours has been a human rights struggle, because we never quite got from that 3/5 of a person that was embedded there in the Constitution.
Tell us about the experience of Asian Americans in terms of fighting to be recognized. I know that there was a very tragic time in the history of Japanese Americans. Talk about that for us a little bit.
Well, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, there was an order issued, Executive Order 9066. And under that order, all of the Japanese in the United States were rounded up and sent to what has been referred to as concentration camps or internment camps. They were forced to sell their businesses, lost a tremendous amount of money. They were forced to sell their homes, lost a tremendous amount of money. And they were rounded up and sent to these camps that were out in the barracks, in the brutal desert, and they were forced to live there. And despite all of that, Japanese American men signed up for the military. The 442nd Battalion is known for its bravery. In the history of the entire military establishment in the United States, that battalion earned the largest numbers of medals for valor. At that time, though, their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, their wives, their children were imprisoned. And I must say that in doing some research on that, and Mayor LaGuardia, for whom one of the CUNY colleges is named, I came across an article in a magazine called The Crisis, which was published and is still, I believe, being published by the NAACP. Mm-hmm. And in that magazine, W.E. Du Bois spoke truth to power. It was one of the very few spaces in American history where people were saying what really was happening. He talked about how the elderly got sick. He talked about the filth and the squalor of those internment camps. He talked about babies dying in the arms of their Japanese mothers. And at that same time, these were a whole group of people that were fighting for the United States. There have been some stories about the liberation of various concentration camps in Europe, where the Japanese liberated those camps, and they were told to move aside so that a white commander could take the picture and have that be publicized in the press back in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So that was a very, I think, dark part of American history, and people don't talk about it.
And it's one of the commonalities that we have, the kind of bias and discrimination. And like Louise was saying, you know, we fought all the way, you know, through the 2 world wars, the Korean War, up until the present day, in an attempt, one, to at first, I think, prove ourselves, you know, prove ourselves worthy of full citizenship, and if we do this, then perhaps we'll be recognized. But also, we were experiencing such suffering here in terms of segregation, denial of job opportunities. So many people went into the military in order to be able to support their families. I can remember my mother talking about when my father went into World War II. She was saying how difficult it was during the Depression, and when they came out of the Depression, and finally at first they wouldn't draft, especially in the South. Oh, you can't go into the service. I mean, we weren't qualified to go into the service, but as the war heated up, then they were accepting, you know, these Negro soldier into the armed services. And when they got there, they had absolutely segregated facilities for them. You know, they had segregated mess halls, they had segregated places where they would go to relax, the canteens, the religious services, everything was segregated. And my father used to write home about that. So it was not a way to get full citizenship. And when they came back from World War II, they went right back into the same fields. There was no veterans program that was really speaking to their needs, no GI Bill to take advantage of, to get a foot up. And for those men who were field hands to start with, when they came back, many of them were kept out of school and only had 3rd grade education. So it was just like a catch-22.
Tell us about the Asian. There wasn't a lot of discussion, particularly historic. What was the role of the Asian woman historically in terms of supporting?
Well, if you focus first on the Chinese American families, because again, the Chinese sent the first, pretty much the largest wave of immigrants to the United States, women did not come early on, and it was primarily a male society. But when they started to come, of course, they were primarily confined to the home as caretakers for the children and the family. Later on, as we got into the 40s, we began to see women play a greater role, as all women in society did, because the men were not here. So that included Chinese women going out to work. It included them working in factories and so on. There were a number that actually became pilots, and these are people that you don't hear about, the women pilots, and so on. So, as time went on, they became more and more engaged in community affairs, but again, largely within their own community. At one point, there is a graduate of Barnard College. She was the first Chinese woman to receive a PhD from Columbia University, became involved in the suffragette movement, yet she was not permitted to become a U.S. citizen at that time. So it's been an interesting thing. But today you find the leadership of many of the not-for-profits and so on are Asian women.
Well, we always had work as African American women. Dating back to slavery, we were in the field right alongside the man. And we worked extremely hard, that same sun up to sundown type of labor. And once we moved to the cities, it was domestic work, and maybe the man was the yard hand. So it was not a matter of being a housewife, you know, by and large. That was very rare. So we, I guess our struggle was to do the kind of work that would, you know, really help us to support a family.
As we continue, this has been a very robust conversation, and we definitely laid out the groundwork in terms of how our collective experiences, the commonalities of our experiences here in this country. In part two, we're going to continue our conversation as we look at the experiences, particularly as we move into the civil rights struggle, the fights for struggle for civil and human rights, as well as some of the current issues that impact our communities, as well as whether it be conflicts, as well as areas of commonality, and basically strategies for bringing our communities more closer together. I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.